Welcome to the Regents Roundtable. I'm Stephen Ludwig. My guest today is Robert Scott. Dr. Scott is President Emeritus and Professor Emeritus at Adelphi University, where he served from 2000 to 2015. He's also President Emeritus and Professor Emeritus of Ramapo College of New Jersey, where he served from 1985 to 2000. He's the only American to serve in the top three posts in higher education: head of an independent university, that's Adelphi; head of a public institution, Ramapo College, and leader of a state higher education coordinating agency, New Jersey and Indiana. Dr. Scott is the author of How Universities Board Works, this book right here. It's very good. I highly recommend it if you're a new trustee or regent or have been on a board for quite a while. It's got a lot of great information. I've enjoyed reading it. Dr. Scott has also published more than 200 articles, essays, invited presentations and reviews in professional and popular journals and newspapers. He's the author or editor of or contributor to 18 books, monographs, and edited volumes on public policy, social issues, and post-secondary education. He's a highly sought-after advisor for public and private university and nonprofit organization boards and presidents on issues of governance, leadership, assessment, and succession planning. I'm super excited to have him here today. Dr. Scott, welcome. And thank you so much for being so generous with your time and talking to me today.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to it, Steve.
Great. So let's just jump in. We know the vast majority of public boards in the United States are appointed by governors. For private institutions, board members are often alumni that can serve both as in an oversight capacity, as well as a fundraising role. In some of your writing, you've argued that there's not enough training for college or university trustees before they serve. Why do you think that is? Why do you think they need more training? And shouldn't the board vetting process be sufficient?
Well, if the board vetting process was adequate, yes, that could be sufficient. But as we know, for most public institutions, there is a political process, as you suggest, mostly through the governor's office with legislative approval, in a few cases by popular election. But in neither case is governance acumen a criterion. And as you suggest, for private nonprofit institutions, there really is a philanthropic motive. I argue that we need better preparation for a very simple reason. Under 15% of American college and university trustees have any professional experience in the enterprise, not just at their institution, but in higher education at all. So can one imagine Google declaring that 85% of its directors did not know the markets in which it served, the particular financing mechanisms, the state-approved mission for student learning? I mean, obviously, Google and Chase and major corporations want directors who can contribute to the strategic thinking of the governance of the enterprise, of the business. Well, when we start off in higher education, that 85% of the directors, the trustees, have no professional experience, we need to substitute for that. And that's why I say training.
What would that look like in your mind?
Well, there's really two dimensions to it. One is higher education as an enterprise beyond the particular institution. It's important, especially when the popular media and pundits talk about hidebound colleges and not being entrepreneurial, et cetera. It's important to take a look at even a brief history of higher education in the United States and to understand the many changes and evolutions and some revolutions that have taken place. I mean, after all, Harvard in 1636 started out to prepare clergy. And look what it is today. When Harvard started in 1636, 3 of the colleges at Oxford were already over 400 years old. So first of all, trustees should know the enterprise and know the dynamic changes that have taken place, not only since the beginning of Harvard, but the land grant acts, two of them, the GI Bill, the Truman Commission in 1947, the Sputnik National Defense Education Act. There's a large context that a trustee should be aware of. And then in addition, to know the individual institution, to know its heritage, its mission. And to me, the starting point for goal setting is the heritage and the mission. But in my thinking, heritage is not an anchor. Doesn't hold us back.
Yeah, tradition is not mission.
Yeah, heritage is a launching pad. What are the principles by which this institution was founded? And what are the ways in which those principles have played a role over the years? And just a quick comment, Adelphi was started in 1863 as an academy, became a college founded by suffragists and abolitionists. And one can trace the history of academic program development that grew out of those principles of innovation and serving the public.
It would have been very helpful for me when Colorado is one of 4 states that elect regents. There's a reason none of the other ones do. It's not a very particularly good idea, but having that context would have been incredibly helpful for me. And I also felt in my 12 years in service, having learned about a lot of the context and a number of the things that you shared were very helpful as I thought about this. The University of Colorado was founded the same year we became a state in 1876. And the universities was a building and an empty field that you got to by horse and buggy. And the major technology of the day was the steam engine. So clearly there's been a change in what we do, how we do it. They became a 4-campus, $5.2 billion enterprise that is radically different. And understanding that there are changes and things can change. And for me, it was helpful when I would go, okay, just because someone says, well, this is the way it's supposed to be. It's like, well, people have made a decision to get us where we are. We can make new decisions to move us forward in new directions. So everything you're saying really resonates with me, because that would have been incredibly helpful in my service to have learned that earlier rather than later.
And let me just add, one should remember that the Land Grant Act was not only about mechanics and agricultural science, but it was about liberal education. It was preparing students for citizenship.
And I think we do forget that, don't we? When we have an argument about liberal arts. I have a degree in philosophy, so I'm horribly biased. But when we've talked to employers about what they want most, yes, they need technical competency, of course, but they also need individuals that can critically think and write and communicate. And now that we're more of a global economy, how do you work with people from other cultures? And a liberal arts education
absolutely
is a great way to get at that. You've argued also that a way to look at this, the training would be some sort of certification. What do you think before they'd be allowed to serve? How do you envision that coming into existence, or how would it continue?
Yeah, there are several states that have initiated, but I don't think they've ever brought to fruition a formal certification process or certification as a requirement. But we require, you think about, in fact, in one article, I use the analogy of people working in a beauty parlor.
Yeah, I remember that.
They have to be licensed by the state.
Yeah.
And yet here we have people responsible for billion-dollar enterprises with no certified learning. So it's probably unlikely that states would require it. However, I do think that the accrediting agencies, that the bond rating agencies, that the audit firms are 3 good candidates for asking questions of the boards that they serve, on providing training for them, and making a more concerted effort to have the board members trained and understand. I mean, I've consulted with colleges in trouble. In one case, the board was surprised by its financial difficulties. I interviewed various members of the board, and I asked the head of the audit committee, who should have been alert, and certainly the audit firm should have been alerting him. And I asked him, how long have you been chair of the audit committee? He said 24 years. That is poor governance.
Wow.
I mean, he went to sleep.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. Now, one of the things, are people, do you think people are concerned if we educate boards too much about how the context of higher education, how it can be that they'll become more involved than they probably already are? So we know some board members like to meddle, and some board members now that are appointed by governors really like to rock the boat on whatever their particular issue is. Do you think some concern with that is that you'd actually empower more quote unquote activist board members, for lack of a better phrase?
Well, of course, it begs the question of the degree of training and how well board members understand the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. Mm-hmm. Now, those are three duties that apply to corporate directors as well. Not so much, well, yeah, they all apply.
Yeah.
But the duty of care is to act as a prudent person would act with regard to the assets and resources, mission fulfillment of the institution. The late David Reisman, a sociologist of higher education, said the role of the trustee is to preserve the university of the future from the actions of the present. Long-term thinking, not short-term thinking. The duty of loyalty, that a trustee has a loyalty to the institution. This institution of which he or she is a trustee. And so that means no conflicts of interest, mm-hmm. no making decisions because it's going to benefit this or that, other than the institution. And the duty of obedience. Obedience meaning fulfillment of the mission, following the mission. For all institutions, the mission statement is part of a charter that is approved by a state. All colleges and universities, whether they are fiercely independent or public, have state-approved charters. And so the obedience is to the fulfillment of the mission in that charter. So if a trustee is activist, as we saw a couple of years ago at the University of Virginia, where a prominent hedge fund manager was on the board and thought the president was not acting aggressively enough to build an online business model, and went around the full board to connive with a couple of trustees to fire the president. Well, it caused a huge scandal, an uproar. And of course, the external accreditors came in and said, hey, wait a minute, you can't do this. You've just violated every principle of governance. But it does take internal outrage and external quality controls to make sure, or to remedy that when it does happen.
Right. You bring up a very interesting point. So you've described the fiduciary responsibility, those duties and fulfillment really well. And so how do you act in the best interest of the institution? And sometimes public institutions, they begin to act what's in their own best interest, but might not be what's in the best interest of the state or fulfilling their mission. For example, if they seek to increase rankings, that requires large investments, new thinking, limiting certain students from coming in. Sometimes they want to expand athletics for whatever reason, and that comes with a large price tag that could put a long-term burden on the institution. So how should trustees balance their concerns of like, this is what's best for the institution versus this is what's best for the institution to fulfill its mission? They're not mutually exclusive, but a lot of times we kind of pretend they are.
Well, one starts again with the mission, and what does the mission say about service to the state and serving the state interests? The mission then becomes the cornerstone to a strategic plan that has to be adopted by the board, should be. Mm-hmm. And that strategic plan should include elements of student enrollment. And yes, some public institutions, in response to state cutbacks in funding, have aggressively sought to recruit and enroll out-of-state students who pay a higher tuition. Well, the board is responsible to monitor. I say one of the principal responsibilities of a board is to monitor the alignment of these variables: the mission, goals, strategies, resource allocation, the reward structure, and results. So within that, let's say that one of the goals is to have a certain enrollment and graduation rates. Well, what are the strategies for doing that? And if one of the strategies is too much international or out-of-state recruitment, out of balance to the commitment to the state, that's a red flag. Or if it's just numbers without regard to graduation rates, that's a red flag. With regard to the reward structure, I like to point out to boards, here's your mission statement with regard to student learning. And part of the strategy for doing that is to hire excellent faculty, full-time faculty. And yet your reward structure provides release time to faculty so they don't have to teach. And you replace them with part-time, adjunct, contingent faculty who often don't have the office space or the time to advise students. There's a misalignment between mission, goals, strategies, rewards, and results. Mm-hmm. And the results overall in higher education deserve a great deal of attention because our graduation rates overall are too low.
Yep. And what I appreciate about everything you just shared is it reaffirms your earlier comments about I have to, as a trustee or regent, I have to have a lot of context to understand all the different things you just walked me through. Yeah. Like if we pull this lever, it's going to have this impact. If we have this reward structure, which we're tempted to do, it's like more research is better because it helps our reputation, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. It has this impact. Right. And if I don't have that background that you mentioned, it might take me a while to learn all that from sitting in there, and that's time missed. So I think that's an excellent kind of convergence of your points. Now, you've worked with regents and trustees at public and private nonprofits across the country, and you've done work outside the United States. What are the most common mistakes that you see boards making, and what do you think we can do to prevent those if I'm an individual trustee or regent?
I think it's ironic. Boards get too much information and too little information. A lot of the information that is sent to board members is sort of puffery, fluff, lots of good news, which is important. They should know the good news. But they all should know the data and the trends. and how things are going. Over the last several years, we've seen a great many colleges close, and colleges seek mergers with other institutions because they all of a sudden, the board realizes this is failing. There are a set of indicators of institutional vitality and vulnerability that ought to be monitored regularly. And surely the audit committee is one. And the audit committee ought to be responsible for what's called enterprise risk management. Indicators of risk beyond the financial numbers, but trends, applications, enrollment, discount rate, withdrawals, transfers out, transfers in, quality measures, not just graduation rates, but placement rates. Colleges should have a rigorous set of academic program reviews using outside experts to review the program, interview graduates, interview students as well as faculty, and reviewing the data book prepared by the faculty of that program. They should have administrative unit reviews because we should be evaluating or assessing our administrative units, whether alumni relations or admissions or career service or student life, against outside benchmarks. Too often, we don't look at those operational indicators, and boards are not prepared. And by the way, this is a case where the accrediting bodies get information too late. Because
lagging indicators.
Right, and too long.
Mm-hmm.
However, they could be organizing and sponsoring seminars for trustees on the indicators to look at. And I think the audit firms could be doing a lot more of this too.
So this ties into the next set of questions. But before I jump into that, you mentioned too much information and too little information. I know trying to define a Goldilocks answer is, because you have boards that oversee systems. You have boards that oversee, in your book, you talk about how many really small colleges there are, and that's an entirely different thing. In the most general way that would be helpful, what should I, as an individual board member, not the chair of the board, what sort of engagement should I expect from the president or the chancellor of an institution on that information getting and conversations or what have you?
Yeah, well, first of all, one of the roles of a board member or regent is to ask questions, not to offer prescriptions, not to say, Madam President, you should do this. But I noticed that X university is doing, Y. Have we thought about it? What do you think about that? So there ought to be questions, and there ought to be frequent, conversations. I never wanted a board bigger than I could contact in a day. Now, sometimes you can't because people are busy or out of town.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for there to be regular communication, keeping the board chair in the loop, copy on an email or what have you. But I think one of the frustration that I had from time to time was board members who didn't speak up, didn't ask a question.
Interesting.
Didn't ask a question. And then after the meeting would call me and say, Bob, I was really upset the way so-and-so asked that question or said this. I said, you're an equal trustee. You could have spoken up. It's especially a problem when boards use conference calls or even Zooms. The board chair or the president has got to be alert and say, we haven't heard from Marcia in a while. Hey, Marcia, what do you think?
Mm-hmm.
So that regular communication is not excessive communication.
Yeah.
It's
Now,
necessary.
are people afraid to speak up because they don't? Again, this is a broad, very broad question. Because I don't have the context that I think I need, am I afraid that I'm going to embarrass myself?
I think it's, in my experience, has been more likely that a board member or two would tend to dominate discussion, and whether they were the board chair or not, they were domineering, and other people, I don't know if they were intimidated, but well, they were silenced.
Yeah.
And so it's important for the board chair or the president, but somebody, to make sure everybody has a chance to speak and contributes. Because after all, what do we want from board members? I mean, a board should have a statement of expectations of what it is, and that's another part of the training. You know, your preparation, being prepared for the meeting, and obviously attending, participation in the meeting, and the third P I use is protection.
Mm-hmm.
You're protecting the integrity of the institution in the fulfillment of your duties. And so there's got to be communication. And then the other part of it with regard to not enough, there should be a data book, a good resource, and there are lots of portals that boards can use, where there's a data book with trends and comparisons. Institutions should have a set of institutions that they think of as aspirational models. They are doing things really well in this way, and we'd like to be able to do that, as well as some other comparisons. So trends, comparisons of data, and information about accreditations and so on.
You know, there's and I don't know how prevalent this is. Again, you would know far better than I would, but there seems to be some pressure, group dynamics in general, but at nonprofit boards and colleges and universities, to the president's a great person, the staffs are great people, my fellow trustees are great people, a go along to get along philosophy and governance. And how do we have the hard line when we need it? It's like, well, you know, Dr. Scott's a great guy. He's, you know, whatever. I trust him. He's doing what he's supposed to do. And if there's a problem, he'd bring it up. I don't have to be super aggressive.
Well, one approach, for every board meeting should have 2 executive sessions. One executive session is with the president alone, without other vice presidents or deans, but so the board and the president, an opportunity for the president to talk about confidential matters, whether they are financial or personnel or strategic, and the board to ask questions of the president. And then the second session, executive session, is without the president, for the board to talk, with the understanding that the board will call the president back in if there are questions that need to be posed to the president. That should give an environment where people can have a good, civil, but challenging conversation.
Do you see people having 2 executive sessions? Is
Absolutely.
that common? Okay.
That's
good. That's the best practice, you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think.
Yeah.
And the other thing I learned once at a board, because I wanted to see minutes, and I learned that the executive session, first executive session, was being taped by the the staff member to the board. And I said, wait a minute, the executive session is a time when board members and the president can speak in great confidence about confidentiality. Having somebody down the hall transcribing this conversation is not a good idea.
In Colorado, we have an open records law for
Yeah.
public meetings like that. So we had to record it, but it only had to be released if there was a question. Otherwise, the tape could be destroyed. So that I get there's a little bit tricky thing, but that's an excellent point. Now, I mentioned activist board members earlier. It's clear that some governors are appointing people with political agendas. How can boards discern what is a political goal? And this sounds really basic, but there's got to be some nuance here. What is a political goal compared to healthy governance when it comes to oversight? Let me give you two examples. Super hot topic right now is free speech on campus. Some are advocating it more than others, so people will frame it as a political issue. One is the other thing about how well does the institution teach civics? Neither one of these should be political in my mind, but they become political hot potatoes. How can I as a trustee or a regent can kind of work with my board and my president on these hotter topics, especially if someone's really trying to stir the pot?
Well, on the second one, the civics, and I mean, once again, we go back to the mission and what is I like to call the president the chief purpose officer. What's the purpose of the institution? And inevitably, there'll be something about preparing leaders and engaged citizens or something like that. Well, the question is, how are we doing that? And one of the questions to be asked is, do our graduates know American history? Do they know constitutional history? And so that's to me, an entirely appropriate set of questions to be asking. Free speech, a university should be a place of ideas and discussion and disagreement and argument in a civil manner. But we usually hear about this issue of free speech or cancel culture when some often right-wing provocateur is asked to leave, or people raise questions. I see no reason why a university has to use student fees to pay provocateurs. When I was at Ramapo College, I learned that a group was sponsoring a Holocaust denier to give a speech. And I learned about it. I saw the literature that was being distributed, and I said, he has a right to free speech. We don't have a right or a necessity to pay him. And if somebody, because it's a public institution, somebody says that we can't deny him, I will debate him. Now, I'm not a historian, but I figured I knew enough and had the ability. And he backed out. He did not want to have a debate. But there are people who, the whole thing about critical race theory, that people are arguing about it as if it's teaching hatred of America. An honest rendering of American history will talk about slavery and taking of the Indian land, the native lands. This is not to denigrate the United States. In fact, it's to fulfill a philosophy of the founders, that we would engage, that we would learn, and we would use our learning to do even better. That's why it's called an experiment. That's why it's called bettering. But we have people who think that to talk about slavery or colonialism is to denigrate America. I served in the Navy. I became anti-war. And there were people saying I wasn't patriotic. I said, no, I'm a patriot. And I'm fulfilling my patriotic duty by calling attention in the Vietnam War era to a war that I don't agree with. That's my freedom.
Yeah, the challenge is when we get into talking points rather than having honest discussions with each other. Yeah. So 2 more questions for you. One of the major roles, and this was pounded into my head, I don't know if other boards get this. Your major job is to hire the executive, the president, or the chancellor, and oversee them. What are some mistakes board makes when it comes to choosing presidents? And how can we do a better job for ourselves and the incoming president or chancellor to set up the proper expectations?
Well, this is an area where political interference occurs.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a story about it. Ramapo College in New Jersey, there is a role called the student trustee. And there was a point at which Ramapo was looking for a president after my time. And the governor wanted a member of his party who was a legislator to be appointed president. There were some openings. The governor appointed, I think, 3 trustees in order to vote for their colleague to be hired. And while the student trustee could not participate in executive session, the student trustee had a full vote at the open session. And the student trustee voted against the appointment, much to the shock of those trustees who hadn't
weren't paying any attention, apparently.
Yeah. So it seems to me that this is an area where the relations with the faculty are very important, in my view. Now, maybe not so much in the system office, I'll leave that aside, but for all campuses. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges that we face are not only ill-prepared trustees and presidents who forget they are chief purpose officers, not just chief executive officers, but one of the areas that we neglect in higher education is the role of the faculty in shared governance. And we do very little to prepare our faculty for leadership, becoming a department chair, or governance, participating in something such as a presidential search. And so some boards get in trouble because they don't involve the faculty in the search and selection of a president. There's an important role for the search firms in this to make sure that the trustees and the search committee have a well-prepared, well-designed prospectus. What is it the campus is looking for? What is needed? Before, when I was at Adelphi and I had told the board that I would not seek to renew my contract after 15 years, so we talked a lot about a search, and I said, the next president might be a younger person with young children at home. They're not going to maybe go out as often at night as I have for the various events. And I asked the person who had written the history of Adelphi to talk to the board about previous presidential transitions. And she said, which I knew because I'd read the book, but it was striking. She said, every incoming president wants to undo what the previous president did. It's as if history didn't exist. Boards need to be clear about what kind of leadership is needed for the next period of time. And this can be particularly challenging if someone has been a successful president for a long period of time. It's sometimes a good idea to appoint someone who's already on campus and can be a transitional leader. The other challenge is if the president served only a very short period of time, and there was a lot of tumult over his or her leadership. But it's a very important responsibility of the board that requires, in my view, participation by the faculty. Because if the mission is about the education of students, it's the faculty who are closest to the students.
Yeah. And I'm sure we could do an entire podcast just on that question. So thank you for trying to make that it was a great answer, but it's like, oh boy, there's a lot, there's a lot there we can unpack. So to wrap up, what is it that you like most about your work in higher education? Previous, current, whatever.
Well, I decided to go into higher education because of the effect of a faculty member and a dean had on my life decisions when I was in college. And I've never regretted it. I'm still in touch with students I knew at Ramapo 35 years ago. One of them just asked me to join. He's the president of a medical school, asked me to join his board. There are students doing all sorts of things. And I think I played a role in helping them shape their values. Mm-hmm. And I have great joy in the lives that they are leading and the contributions they are making. And the same is true for faculty whom I have helped nurture. So it's been a life of giving and getting. And it's a noble enterprise, and I want it to continue to be a noble enterprise, which is why I devote so much attention to writing about higher education and consulting.
Mm-hmm. I went to, when I first got on the board, I was a student leader at the University of Colorado in the 90s. I was an older, non-traditional student. And a professor I knew that was in faculty leadership was retiring. And I went to his retirement party, and I was humbled and envious in a very positive way of all the people that were there that shared with him how he had touched their lives in such meaningful and profound ways. And when I'd be in board meetings and the faculty would get up and share about their breakthrough research and how it impacted these people or individual students, it was like, I just felt and continue to feel an honor to be even related to that work.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate what you say, because it speaks loudly to me. Is there anything that I didn't ask you today that you'd like to add? We covered a huge amount of territory.
Right. Well, we did. Of course, there are trends in higher ed. I'm going to be giving a talk soon to the senior management at Grant Thornton, and they want to talk about trends in higher education. And there's a lot to talk about there. Mm-hmm. There's some 36 million people in the United States who have some college credits, but no college degree. Mm-hmm. Our alumni offices contact them for donations, but our admissions offices don't contact them to re-enroll.
Wow.
So there's a whole topic there.
Oh, yeah. I love higher education, and then I get upset when we get in our own way.
Yeah, exactly.
And when we get in our own way. Well, Dr. Scott, this has been incredibly enlightening. Maybe we can have you back again in the future date if you're open to that. I am honored to have talked to you again. How university boards work. Get it now wherever you get your books. It's a great book and a super helpful resource. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Be well.